Well, good morning. I'm glad that you're here today, and I hope you were here last week and got to hear Pastor Syme from Cambodia. I know some of you probably were not, but I consider him a very special person. From the very moment I met him, it was just obvious that the Spirit of the Lord dwelled in him richly, and he just loved people. He loves people and loves what he's called to do there in Cambodia. And one of the reasons I like for people like him to share, if you'll think over the last couple of years, we've had a gentleman from Pakistan who spoke, and we had a couple from India who have a ministry to temple prostitutes, and we've had a variety of people like Vicky Adundo who has a children's home in Kenya. And I like for those people to share for several reasons. One is generally they are people who are risking their lives to some extent or sacrificing their lives to some extent to really fulfill the call that God has for them in their given countries. In fact, the couple from India, they were here recently and I was talking with them, and the lady, when she was leaving, she said, "I felt so encouraged just by our conversation." And I'm like, wow, I'm the one who feels encouraged. I didn't know that I was helping you feel encouraged. But she explained that where she is, mostly they're Hindu people who think that they are odd being Christians. And then there are Christian people who think they are odd because they minister to temple prostitutes and their families. And she said, really, most people just think we're weird. And I was just so honored to be with them. I thought what they're doing is really an extraordinary call of God. And so there's a second reason, too, that I enjoy meeting people from around the world who know Christ. And that is there's a kindred spirit that is obvious almost immediately. And that is that the Spirit of God dwells in them, and He's doing a similar thing in their lives to what He's doing in ours. It's always different, but I mean, He's teaching them truth. He's calling them to love people around them, even the people who are difficult to love. And He's calling them to fulfill the specific ministry, whatever it might be, that they're created for. But in talking with some of those folks, I mentioned to Pastor Syme, I said, well, first I asked him, what are the barriers for people in Cambodia coming to know Christ or walking with Him? And he explained one of them last weekend, that a lot of it is ancestral worship. That because of their pagan background and the Buddhist worship that they have, that they tend to worship their ancestors. And people there fear that if they come to know Christ, they have to somehow abandon their family, which is not true, but that's what they fear. And he said that's one major barrier. But he didn't share this on the weekend, but I wish he had. I asked him in that conversation beforehand, are there other barriers? And he said, materialism. Now, you would think in Cambodia, where he was talking about people earning $150 a month, and that was a good income, things like that, you would think materialism there would not be a primary barrier. But in fact, because they've gotten more industry and more people working, although they're in garment factories, things like that, not making high wages, they're making a lot more than what they were making working in the rice paddies. And he said people there, they do have access to technology and cell phones and things like that. And he said materialism, modernism, essentially is a barrier to people walking with Christ, even in a country that is lesser developed. And you know, it's the same thing here. In fact, I said to him, I believe the greatest barrier to people in the United States having a deep and true walk with Christ is comfort. That we have it too easy. I mean, for example, in many parts of the world throughout history, the concept of heaven was something you longed for. Because the walk of this life was a challenge, a struggle. It was difficult day by day. I really don't think too many Americans long for heaven because they have it pretty comfortable where they are. And likewise, longing for Christ, yearning for righteousness, yearning to walk with Him is something that when you're in a desperate situation or you're under great pressure or you have great needs, that you're seeking Him. But when you have comfort, there's not a lot of impetus to seek Him. And really, I think it behooves each of us to really look at our own lives and say, what are the things that maybe desensitize me or comfort me to the place that I'm not really thirsting to know Christ? Now, that does fit into what I want to talk about today. I'm going back to this series we had entitled Wired for Wisdom. And most of this time, we've been in the book of Ecclesiastes. It wasn't explicitly a study of Ecclesiastes, but we've been there. And in fact, if you'll recall, we spent several weeks talking about the first few verses in chapter 3 that say the specifics about there is a time for every season, a season for every activity under heaven. And so the consequence is that we're going on to the very next verses here, but it's a changing pattern. And in fact, the writer in this case seems to be having sort of a dialogue more than anything else. Because, if you go out to lunch with somebody, you may go there thinking you want to talk about one or two specific things. But most of the time, what do? You might talk about those and about a half a dozen other things, or maybe more. That conversations have a way of just sort of jumping around a little bit, and you start off here and you end up over here and you go, now what was it that we were talking about that got us over here? And it seems that way with the writer of Ecclesiastes here in these few verses, that he jumps around, but yet I think there's a bit of a central theme there, and it has to do with what I entitled Eternal Eyes. You'll recall a couple of weeks ago we were talking about walking by faith and not by sight, or having eyes that were eternal, and this is essentially what we're building upon today. So here we go in the start of this. It's verse 10 and 11. It says, I have seen the burden that God has laid on men. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Now, the part that I highlighted there is the part that I want to spend some time on. He says that God has set eternity in the hearts of men, yet we cannot fathom what he has done from beginning to end. Now, there is an interesting concept there, is there not? That God has set eternity in our hearts. In fact, the way we tend to view life is as if we've been here forever and we will be here forever. In fact, I like to joke around occasionally, especially back when I was teaching at the college, and we'd be talking about some historical event like World War II or something, and in those cases, those kids, as I'd been there for a while, they were getting so young I could talk about much more recent things, and they hadn't even been born yet. And I might call on one of them and say, where were you in 1949? And of course, they had that look of, well, I don't know. But the reality is we tend to sort of know about history almost as if we were there. And we tend to think about the future as if what? We will always be there. Now, I can remember being, I'm going to guess in the age range of 10 to 13, something like that, and thinking about death. And of course, I'd heard that the average age of a person in the United States was around 75 years or something like that. And at that age, I would sort of dwell upon that a little bit, not too long because it would scare me, but I would dwell upon it a little bit and think about that being out there somewhere, like it may be age 75. And in my mind, it seemed so far away that it was as if it would never happen. You understand what I mean by that? That there's this concept that you realize now it's out there, but it's just so far out there that really I don't have to worry about that. Because the scripture says God has set eternity in the hearts of men. There is this knowing in our hearts that we will exist beyond the grave. There's a reality to that. Part of that is because we are created by God, who himself has no beginning and no end. We are eternal beings because of his work. The question is only, what is our eternal destiny? Will it be with him or apart from him? But there is this sense in every person that there is something beyond death. And in our minds, we have a very difficult time fathoming that there is an end point to this life. In fact, is it not true that in about everything that we undertake, we think of it as if it is eternal? In other words, you think of, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to major in a certain field, and I'm going to start working in that field, almost as if you're going to do that forever. Like maybe you went to school and studied hard, you became a medical doctor, and you employed your skills in so much hard work that they put in, especially in those early years, as if it's going to happen forever. And yet I have some friends who are retired medical doctors, that those years passed quickly, and all that they worked so hard for early in life, it came to a point of no longer do I apply my skills in that way. And there are a lot of things in life that have this reality to them, that in our minds we think as if it is eternal in nature, when it's only temporal or temporary for a season of this life. And see, that's part of what he says when he says that yet man cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. We can understand a little, we have some concept, but we really cannot fathom the reality that 100 years ago, I don't suppose there's anybody in this room who's 100. I know one person who attends the church here who's, I think, 91 or 92 now. But 100 years ago, none of us were alive. This church didn't exist. More than likely, there were cows roaming around where you are seated right now, or some other farm animal. And yet, in our minds, it's as if the season that I'm in now is permanent. And the consequence, I think, is that we tend to sort of reverse things. That is, instead of being focused on that which is eternal, we tend to be focused on that which is only of this life. And we have our hierarchy of importance upside down. We take temporary things and consider them most important, and things that have an eternal nature and consider them of lesser importance. Now, the scriptures makes it clear that those things that are eternal are what? Loving God, relationship with Him, and loving people, relationships with them. That everything else of this world is transient, it's temporary, it's only going to have a season that will pass. Yet, if we were to have a test that all of us could take of the things that have an eternal significance, that really matter, and how much of our time, how much of our energy, our resources, our mind, how much is invested in those versus how much is invested in this life, I dare say that it's out of balance in a way that we wouldn't be happy about. And I think in the culture in which you and I live, it is even more difficult to maintain an eternal focus than ever. Back to that thing of comfort and pleasure and all the joyous things that we have of this life, many of which are good things, but they distract from that which eternally matters. Now this week, I had a good opportunity. I have a friend that I've known for many, many years, knew him back long before I knew the Lord. And in fact, years ago, we were roommates. And over the years, we've stayed in touch, but we live fairly far away from each other, so we just talk occasionally and see each other occasionally and so forth. And many of you know that how the years have a way of passing far too quickly, and you don't even realize, gosh, it's been 5 years or 10 years since we spoke or something like that. And it so happened that he was coming through this area, so we made a plan to stop for lunch and just chat and so forth. And I guess there was some spirit of evil who didn't want me to be there, because it happened that the day before my wife's car broke down and she needed mine desperately, so I really had no way to get there. I thought I was going to have to ride my bicycle to go and see my friend. But fortunately, she dropped me off. And then later I was planning to hitchhike. I thought, well, if necessary, I'll just hitchhike. Somebody will pick me up. I've done that before. It's worked out fine. I'm serious. Now, well, I have to tell the story. We were out cycling one day. We were out cycling out near Piney Flats, and I didn't have just a flat tire. I had a part of my bike break. I mean, it was no longer, I couldn't ride it. And I was with a group, but all I could do was walk at that point and carry the bike. And I said, hey, go on, it's fine, I'll hitchhike. And some of them were concerned that I shouldn't be doing that, but there was a four-way stop up there. I just went to the stop and sat there and waited till somebody came along. And I thought, anybody with a truck, hey, I can jump right in. And sure enough, the guy picked me up, threw the bike in the back. He brought me back, and we passed them on the road. I waved at them as we were going by. So I enjoy hitchhiking sometimes. That had nothing to do with today's sermon, but hey, if you're on the side of the road, I'll pick you up, okay? Now, somebody needs to be in charge of keeping me on track. I got really distracted last night, all right? But anyway, I was saying that I was meeting my friend for lunch, and so we met there. And now, remember, we knew each other long before I knew Christ, okay? And I thought, I don't get to see him very often. And in reality, the last time I saw him was about 10 years ago. And I thought, we're not getting any younger. I'm not going to waste any time. So we'd been there. We chatted about family things and so forth and the menu and so forth. And finally I said, so where do you stand with God? Or something along that line. And he didn't quite answer the question. And I think he said something like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, where do you stand with God? And he said, well, I pray regularly. I don't go to church. There are hypocrites in the church. And he went off on this dialogue of, the reason I don't go to church is these people do this and these people do that and so forth and so on. And which is a common defense mechanism, isn't it? It's their fault, not mine. And I said, well, in reality, I think we're all hypocrites. That to some extent we all portray we're something when in reality we're something a little different. But we chatted a while, but I kept sort of pushing him. And I said, have you invited Christ into your heart? And he said, well, if you put it that way, no. Now, for some people, if I had been pressuring them this much, they probably would have what? Maybe gotten angry, at least changed the topic or something, right? But we've been friends long enough. I even said to him, I said, I love you enough to ask you some tough questions. That he didn't get up and run. Now, I had to back off a little bit because I did need a ride at the end of the day, right? But I mean, he was willing to talk. And I know his wife, a very sweet lady. They've been married a long time. And I said to him, do the two of you ever talk about it? That is, talk about God and death and things like that? What do you think his answer was? No. Don't talk about it. Now, I didn't ask him why they didn't talk about it, but I can speculate. What would you speculate? Fear. Yeah, afraid to address that question. And it goes right back to what we were talking about here. Now, it's something, they know it's out there, right? In fact, we had talked about the fact that his father had passed just a few years ago, and he was even still grieving. He said it still bothered him. So he's very aware of the reality of death, but obviously they didn't want to talk about it because what? It was something that was too intimidating, too fearful, and because eternity is set in the hearts of men, there is this sense in us that what? We can defer that question. That, it doesn't feel like I'm going to die tomorrow. Now, it could be, you might get a diagnosis that tells you got a short period of time. That might change your perspective. But if everything's going along sort of normal, it's like eternity is set in my heart. You don't think of it in that way, but that's really what you're doing. And you're pushing that off as if I have an eternal time to address that question. And again, because I was friends enough with him, I said, look, you and I are not getting any younger. I mean, none of us knows. He was even passing through here on the way to a doctor's appointment, And the reality is that for any of us at any age, even very young, there could be a limited amount of time. But at least as we get older, there should be some wisdom about eternity is set in my heart, but it's not set in my body. This physical body is not eternal. My soul and my spirit, they're eternal, but they're going to exit this body. I'm going to get a new spiritual body, a new heavenly body. But the wise person addresses this issue. And then I began to tell a few stories of people that I've known who've passed, some of whom were very young. And I said, when I do funerals, I often say that a person is not prepared to live until they are prepared to die. You're not prepared to live until you're prepared to die, because part of what's going on in a human life when they're not yet prepared to die is that they are living in sort of a protective cocoon, or trying to avoid the things that are too risky. But when one is prepared to die, then they're prepared to live life at a more risky level, like these people that we've been meeting from around the world who are risking their lives literally to walk with Christ. I had a friend in seminary. His name was Harsha Kumar, and he was from India. And Harsha was a very, very kind gentleman. He was very articulate, meaning an excellent speaker. And I didn't know him for an extremely long period of time, but in the short period of time that I did know him, I just really grew to respect him greatly. And after that season, he was back in India, and he had even told me, and I was aware, that part of their work, he had a ministry there, was to go into northern India near Pakistan. And that is a risky area because it's predominantly Muslim. It's not as strong Hindu as in some of the other parts of the country. And I knew that, and I knew he was doing ministry there. And then I got a shocking report that came from his wife that he had actually been speaking in a church up in northern India, and there was an explosion right outside the church, and he was killed as he was speaking about Christ. And his wife, she sent some letters. She was deeply grieved, but at the same time, she was thankful that he died doing what God had called him to do. And she was planning to keep the ministry going as best she could. But you see, in his case now, he was prepared to die, and as a consequence, he was risking his life for the gospel of Christ in an area that was dangerous. And unlike us, comfort was not his primary concern, you see. That eternity was set in his heart, but he had an eternal perspective that this life is not the most important. It is my relationship with Christ and what he is calling me to do. So here's the critical question in this. And that it is along the lines of, can you sift the days of your lives, the activities of your lives, along the idea of whether or not you are investing them in things that have eternal significance, or are they just sort of flittering away in things that really don't have an eternal impact? Now, there is this sense of eternity in our hearts, and we sort of think, I have a long time, but in reality, maybe you don't. In fact, I shouldn't say maybe. In reality, you don't. Nor do I. And see, it is a wise thing to sort of keep up to date in all relationships. That is, to the extent that is possible for you, that you would exercise what the scripture refers to as the ministry of reconciliation, that you would keep clean accounts and forgiveness, and you would have healthy relationships with everybody that you're connected with to the extent that it's within your control. I know that there are some relationships that it's beyond your control to bring about reconciliation because there has to be a response by the other person. And it also is wise at all times to think in terms of, what is it that God would want me to do in terms of investing my minutes, my hours each day in ways that have eternal significance? Now, I think, particularly when I was younger, how I squandered so many days of my life on things that had no eternal value. I mean, just zero. They were really things that were selfish, or me seeking to gain something in this world that I thought was so important that in reality it won't matter. It'll just pass. Now we go a little further here. It's still in Ecclesiastes. Now notice the verses I had there before were 10 and 11. So these are the verses right around it. And as I said earlier, that the writer seemed to be jumping around, but I think he had a primary theme. And in that context of talking about eternity, he says, what does the worker gain from his toil? He says, I know that there is nothing better for men than to be happy and do good while they live, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is the gift of God. In other words, he's talking about eternal things and an eternal perspective, but he almost says, but how do I live now? What do I do just day by day? And of course, in another part of Ecclesiastes, he's talking about, look, everything's meaningless. It's a chasing after the wind. And yet he says, there's nothing better than to be happy, to do good, to find satisfaction in all your toil. Now, the part about do good, I don't think it's referring to do good as if you're going to earn something, because going back to the conversation I had with my friend, he said, he was talking about the hypocrites in the church and so forth, and he says, I try to live a good life. And I said to him, I said, well, you and I spent time around each other years ago, and in fact, I would have to say that you were better than me. That if you were talking about living a good life, that you had a higher standard than I did, and that's great. I said, but it only takes one sin to separate you from God. And all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, and there is no person who is good enough. I guess I was being harder on him than I thought I was. But see, I was explaining that in reality, what you're doing is trying to hope that you'll be good enough that when you die, that God will say, it's okay, that you behaved adequately. Which in reality, none of us could do. In fact, there's a little side bit there. That day we went to the Crazy Tomato, which I like it there. By the way, I recommend the spinach lasagna or the spinach parmesan. But anyway, there was this young lady who was waiting on us, and nice young lady, and I was just in one of my moods where I was giving her a bit of a hard time, all right? And I did so throughout the time that she served us, and we were there a pretty long time. And so then I went up to pay the bill, and I had just finished writing on there the tip, and I was signing it when she said, you're the pastor at Celebration, aren't you? And I went, yes. And she said, I go there. I said, ooh, if I had known that, I would have behaved better. I probably would have given her a bigger tip if she'd said that 30 seconds earlier, too. Right? But, there is this reality, like in his case, that there's no way to behave well enough, and even there, I was probably a little off the mark. Actually, it was all in jest, but in honesty, if I had realized that she had tended here, I probably would have put on my priestly collar and acted a little bit nicer. No, not really. Just kidding. But now you see, none of us can be good enough. And he says, look, there is this place to find satisfaction in the toil of your life. Now remember, part of the curse was what? That work would be toilsome. That there is a challenge to it. It is difficult. And yet I believe that when one knows Christ and follows him and then allows him to use your gifts and talents, the ones that he's given to you, allows him to use them to his glory, that curse is redeemed or taken away. In other words, that if you're gifted in a certain area and you're allowing God to use you in that area, that there is a sense of satisfaction. If you're gifted, say, as a teacher and you're working as a teacher, if you're gifted in terms of mercy and you're working, say, as a nurse or something like that, or anything that you're doing, maybe you're gifted in craftsmanship and you're a carpenter, or maybe you use that same gift in farming, or whatever it might be. That wherever God has called you, the gifts and talents that you have, as you use them according to his plans and purposes, that there is satisfaction in that. That it was a good day. Like there's a gentleman in this church, I told you my wife's car broke down. He came and he repaired it for us, got it back on and operating and so forth. And he's gifted with his hands. And now he serves other people through the gift of doing this that has an eternal perspective. Because ultimately, what does that come down to doing? Loving other people. And that matters eternally. And that's what he's talking about here, that there's this sense of eternity, but if I'm working in a way that is under the Lord, that it really does have meaning beyond just today. Now, let me go a little further here. In the very next verse, it says, I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken away. God does it so that men will revere him. Now, if you think about it, everything that God has created in this world is set for the purpose of people having the perfect context in which to know him or reject him. That is, he has allowed evil for a season. Ultimately, that will be ceased. But he has allowed evil for a season that humans might see, that humans might rebel in their own hearts against him. But against that backdrop of evil, you can see the reality of the goodness of God. And in the hardship of this life and the challenges of this life, yet you can see, for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, you can see the work of God in the human experience. Now, the reality is, the older I get, and the more I understand about this life, the less I know. And what I mean by that is that I recognize more and more the majesty, the sovereignty, the glory of God, his infinite wisdom, his infinite purposes, and how small I am in that whole framework. And so it says that what he does, everything he does, it will endure forever, and it has as its purpose for us to revere him. And the more I walk with him, it's like the closer my knees get to staying on the ground all the time. I mean, that I might be humble before him and revere him and respect everything that he is doing. Because you see, too, in the next passage it says, look, whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before. And God will call the past to account. There's a parallel passage also in Ecclesiastes in another chapter. It says, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, it's something new? It was here already long ago. It was here before our time. Now, you might first look at that and say, well, I don't think that's true. I mean, there seems to be a whole lot of new things, new technology, new information. I mean, we have the internet and cell phones. All that didn't exist just a few years ago. There's a whole lot that's new. What is new about the human experience? I mean, there's birth and there's death. There are the relationships that we have in between. There's the opportunity to know God. The way that humans interact, the principles of human life are eternal. In fact, that's why we can study Scripture that in some cases it's thousands of years old. You go back in the Old Testament, and yet the principles there or the stories there are as applicable today as they were thousands of years ago. You take Cain and Abel, the jealousy, the bitterness, the hatred that formed between the two of them, to the extent that one would kill the other. Explains a lot of what goes on in our world today. When it says there is nothing new under the sun, what it is saying is there is nothing new under the sun about the human experience. That the principles of human life are the same today as they were for the people of Old Testament Israel or any time since. And it all comes back to that thing of what God has created is for the purpose of people knowing Him, revering Him, humbling themselves before Him. I dare say if we could truly see our hearts, all of us are more prideful than we should be in light of who God is. That even the most humble among us, the most broken and contrite, still yet, in comparison to who He is, there's pride in our heart. And what He calls us to do is live humbly, seek justice, mercy, and really carry out what He's called us to do in this temporal realm, because it does matter eternally. Now, my friend that I had lunch with, I didn't like slam him up against the wall and say, now accept Christ or nothing else. I once knew a guy who, he said, he got this other guy in a headlock and said, now I'm going to hold you here till you forgive me. Because they'd been having an argument. He was a pretty strong dude. And he got the other guy in a headlock and said, now you're going to have to forgive me. I'm like, I don't know if that'll work. But I'm praying that the Spirit of the Lord is going to speak to him deeply. I trust that He will. That he would gain an eternal perspective that's beyond what he's had up to this point. And so let me conclude by leaving this question before you that hopefully you'll ask yourself often. That is, am I investing myself today in things that matter eternally? In other words, when you go through any given endeavor this week or things that you're thinking about doing, that you might ask yourself, does this eternally matter? Or could I invest my time in a better way? Just yesterday, I had something that I had planned to do that I really was looking forward to. It was going to be sort of fun. And yet it was a little bit on the selfish side in terms that it didn't have any real impact for anybody else. And then my son asked me to do something for him. Now, it was something that he and I had planned to do together, but he was going to be out of town. He's like, Dad, you do it for me. I'm like, I don't want to do it. So he left. I wrestled with it a while. Then I remembered I was teaching on this topic. So I made the right choice. I tried to do what he wanted me to do. Now, see, does that matter, though? Because what was it really about? Loving him, trying to do what mattered for him, or really loving what? Myself. And see, now, if it has an eternal perspective, it's going to be about loving people or loving God. Always. Let's pray. Lord, I do pray that you would give each person here wisdom, that in whatever we're involved in life, that we would truly have an eternal perspective to sort out the things that matter, where we should invest our lives, and to let go of the things that really, they don't have any significance. Lord, I pray for any person here who's hurting, who's wounded. Just ask for your healing hand upon them. And I pray this in Christ's name. Amen.